Hello, my name is Hugh Patterson, and I'm presenting today the role of the language community in the peer review process for collections. My co-authors here are Dr. Richard Grissom and Dr. Lauren Collister. And we are presenting today at the Language Documentation and Archiving Conference hosted out of Berlin, but held online. So I wanted to take a couple of frames out of this, and by frames, what I mean is that our in linguistics, in the study of semantics, we have Dr. Charles Fillmore and Dr. Gil Fauconnier, who talked about frames in semantics and kind of the association of ideas, or what is the perspective here. So Fauconnier wrote mental spaces, aspects of meaning construction in natural languages. So I chose two frames out of our title: language community and peer review process. Now, in the literature, we've seen some discussion about, most recently out of the journal Language, by two authors together on a joint paper, and then a couple years previously, a joint paper out of a journal in Australia. So I wanted to take these two frames because in language documentation, we often try to relate things to the community engagement component. And here is something that is beginning to be discussed more openly, and we think rightfully so, that's often very connected to the scholar component of community collaborations between academia, or scholarly collaborations between scholarship institutions and communities. So we wanted to look at these kind of frames, and we're hoping that we can be a source of ideation and open vision casting in this presentation as we frame these two ideas and look at these two frames. Now, in terms of a background, the three of us, we are co-editors at the Journal of Open Humanities Data, and Language Documentation Collections and Assessment and Recognition is still an open collection that is receiving submissions for peer-reviewed articles on this topic. And we are well aware, and I think many of us in the audience today are also well aware of review processes, peer review processes that are like open review, blind review, double blind, triple blind. But we wanted to take this opportunity at in the journal, in the Jode Journal, to facilitate discussion around how peer review and goals, the goals of peer review, might coexist with the various needs of stakeholders in language resource creation and language resource use. So I'm going to walk through and define a little bit of one of those frames. We'll take the peer review frame, and this, I think, is a very stereotypical kind of frame process that fits within that frame. So an author submits an article, the article is assessed by an editor and sent to reviewers. They give feedback to the editor on whether it fits the scope of the publication. Then the editor makes a decision based on the recommendations and communicates again with the author about some sort of revisions that need to be made, and then it's accepted and published and put into the style sheet in the format that is dictated or discovered or controlled or created by the publisher, right? But there's a couple of things in this. This is not the only kind of peer review, right? There's, if we look at more broadly the different kinds of works, some peer review is more book-like. If you're writing a monograph and you are working with a publisher, then you might have a more involved review process with a single peer reviewer that may bring about, you may have an editorial review that involves restructuring the narrative. Or you may have more simplistic reviews that in journal articles that deal with terminology, typography, ideology, and grammar. So generally, though, peer review what's gained for in the process of peer review is theoretical appropriateness, accuracy of claims, clarity of expression. And some of these changes that are asked of in manuscripts are significant changes, and some are minor changes. Some take a lot of time, some take a very little amount of time. So when we look at how peer review is structured, as we looked at that slide in the last thing, so publishers have several roles, right? And peer reviewers in many cases are looked at as not being the friend of the submitter, but rather the friend of the editor working on behalf of the publisher. So they, in some ways, they represent the publishing house or the publishing authority. And so, but publishers have a very significant role in this, right? So they dictate the format under which articulated knowledge exists or is experienced. They provide continuity to access expressions of knowledge, right? So they are an access point, and they provide brand continuity and trust across knowledge products. And these are the kinds of things that we see of traditional publishers, but also in language documentation, we see these things happening now for language archives. So I think these ideas fit somewhere inside of this frame of peer review, at least at a very deep level, right? But peer review in and of itself is very important for a variety of reasons around the world, and it has different weights around the world, but in different scholarly systems. And so it acts as a way to signify trusted sources of information, right? So the peer review process, by speaking to issues of authority, to issues of theoretical appropriateness or appropriateness of the scope of the publishing venue, then peer review speaks to several different dynamics, whether it's academic truth, validity of claims, social acceptance of results. Those are all important things that peer review brings to a process. So if we go back to the idea of bringing these two different frames, one of peer review, one of community participation, then we need to think about, okay, so what are we bringing together in these frames? What are the ground assumptions that we are bringing together? Now, I want to point out here something else, that is, when scholars look at a language resource, they're especially in the peer review process, they're looking at it in the language resource as an object. That is the way that they're treating it. And then when the community is looking at it, I'm not sure exactly how to define community. And in fact, many of us aren't. One paper that I consulted suggested there was over 120 different definitions of language community. And this has been a challenge for documented in the literature for language archives for a while. So how do you know where the community starts and stops? But that issue aside, assuming that we could agree that there is a participatory component and that we can find the limits of communities often approach language resources as a resource of instrumentation. So it's an instrument rather than an object. And so the idea here is parallel to that expressed by Pierre Bourdieu in 1977 in an article titled "The Economics of Linguistic Exchanges," and that was published in Social Science Information. So building on that split, that in utilization of language, peer review, we would like to suggest possibly that peer review is language resources as objects of understanding versus language resources as instruments of social action. And so these two perspectives also bear in these two different frames. And so we're asking very open-ended question and saying, okay, do these frames merge? Should they merge? What happens if they do merge? And what does that mean for our discipline moving forward? We would like to suggest that possibly they don't merge. And in fact, to better understand this, we would like to introduce the third frame, and that is collection assessment. Now, collection assessment is a broader idea than just peer review. It doesn't have the same necessary meaning, or maybe it could. We don't necessarily dictate the answer to that, but we would like to arrange it kind of like this. that collection assessment has multiple components. It has perhaps a peer review and more of a community involvement component, two components, and we'll suggest here in a minute that there'll be a third component. But what is clear in this traditional peer review is that we could assess collections as a product for their form and the fit of that form to some sort of criteria. This would allow reviewers of collections to be objective in their review process. Now, I suggest with my co-authors that the community involvement component is designed for social fit, is best understood as, what is the social fit for this collection? We don't have a set of metrics yet for whether a collection socially fits or not, but maybe you have some use cases that you could share. The third component that we would like to suggest belongs in this new frame of collection assessment would be the content fit. So in one way, we could say is the arrangement of the resources in the collection appropriate, and in the new frame is the description of the resources in the collection appropriate. And this would be two different criteria to evaluate a resource collection upon. And finally, then we would have the use and what might be a good, what is the use dynamics of a particular collection. So we did some thought experiments to see if we merge these two frames instead of introducing a new frame or two new frames, what would happen? So the goals here, to be explicit, the goals from the two different frames are very different, right? One's language resource as an instrument of social action. The other is a language resource as an object of understanding. And so one of the things that we came up with is that peer review versus contributor. At what point does a peer reviewer become a contributor to a collection? So some things to consider is that a peer reviewer makes suggestions on behalf of another party, whereas a contributor makes changes under their own authority. A peer reviewer gives up rights to be acknowledged for their contribution, whereas a contributor retains rights to be attributed for their contribution. And a peer reviewer frames a secondary narrative around a product as they evaluate it for truth values in a variety of ways. But a contributor becomes part of the team creating the original product. We still think there's a couple other areas that deserve investigation, and we want clear roles around collections. So if we look at peer reviewer versus contributor, which we did on the previous slide, there's also a very unclear difference between what is a peer reviewer versus a curator of a collection. Both would represent the publishing institution, or the archive, right? What's the difference between a peer reviewer and a user of a collection? If we are coming at that question from the frame of the community engagement. And finally, what is the difference between a peer reviewer and an editorial reviewer? How much change or the organizational structure of the collection needs to change to help it make sense to end users of a variety of types? So we also want to we had two really important questions. We acknowledge that the definition of language community is somewhat ambiguous and can vary from situation to situation. But if we were to look at that and say, okay, the language community provides us with some sort of feedback and review mechanism or assessment for a collection, then when the sociology and the social situations of that community change, what does that mean for the collection? And if we base our assessment of approval off of some earlier version of that social fit of the corpus or the collection as a product, only a collection here. I'd make a distinction in another paper here at this conference, is that, so where do we, how long is it good for? How do we reassess when the social situation has changed? So we want to affirm in our conclusions here that we do think that building collections as linguists and as community engaged participant researchers is very important, not only to our career, but to the people that we work with and serve through our scholarship. And so we think that should be part of the recognition of somebody's career path. But we are left with some questions that we hope that you can help us answer together as a community. And are the reviewers reviewing the content or the engagement experience versus, so as publishers and language archives, maybe this means that we need to have exhibits for collections as well as their explicit deposits in archives and repositories. Additionally, when and what ways is it appropriate to acknowledge reviewers of corpora and collections? And so do reviewers become contributors? I talked about this a little bit on the previous slide, but addressing the relationships of the community engagement and the relationship to the peer review is an important component of the tradition from language documentation and moving from language documentation into language revitalization. So I want to say thank you for listening. We appreciate your thoughtful response. And if you wanted to make a submission to the JODE, the Journal of Open Humanities Data, we'd be very happy to help you with that and to find peer reviewers for your article. And we think that you have some great responses to this, and we're happy to hear those both here at the conference and help you possibly make those into print. Thank you.